man discovers the power of visibility, and that's, of course, the basic story of The Invisible Man, both in 1933 and more recently a very different version, 2020, with Elizabeth Moss. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
So I think this time was an interesting question would be, we've talked about this in some different ways, but what's the most important part of adapting an older movie like this one for a modern audience to you?
For me, it's reinventing the core themes in a different setting or a modern setting, or even just a way that just feels more relevant, even if it's not set in this time period. And I mean, for me, the underlying theme that is carried over is this idea of accountability and society's rules, and what happens in the absence of them. And you know, if you are completely above the law or outside of the normal bounds of what's acceptable behavior, or then what could the potential sort of outcome of that be? So, and I think that for me is the most sort of relevant thing that carries over from both. I think we'll get into how the 2021 is different from the original 33, because it is very different. But that's the common sort of tangent, and I think that it's what's clever is they have carried that over, and also this idea of power can, unchecked, becomes a corrupted force. So for me, that's really really getting to the heart of what the original is about, and repackaging it in a way that isn't too similar, but also adds some new dimensions. And that's there's not one hard and fast rule for adapting an original movie and remaking it, but you definitely have to bring something special and relevant, and actually something unique and new really to the table if you're going to remake something. There's this thing of it's too easy to do something lazily and just sort of repackage it, but I think you have to bring a new element. And if in a nutshell I can say the element that's brought into the new one is this idea of relationships and abuse, is the kind of added bonus, if you will, for the new one. How about you?
I think part of making it relevant is having a character that the audience can really relate to and connect with and stuff. And Elizabeth Moss, we certainly saw that in Handmaid's Tale, and we see it again here. That like you and I kind of jokingly offline talked about her being kind of typecast in a way of being the traumatized victim and stuff. At the same time, she's definitely not a kind of shrinking violet, though. She fights back, and that's I think that's the other part that that's what makes her a heroic figure and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's what she excels at. Is this? She manages to portray someone who gets progressively more traumatized to the point of almost breaking point, who then but also a level of empowerment to sort of challenge that and conveys that, really effectively.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
So let's dive into 1933. It's like you said, it's a very different movie. It's let's call it I think of it as kind of like, kind of campy by today's standards, almost kind of funny, more funny than scary in a lot of ways.
Yeah. There's lots of it's quite a sort of almost like a dark comedy, really, than an out and out horror movie. There's lots of quite silly bits in it, but also in terms of there's a progression in the book of Griffin becoming more and more insane as the story goes on. Right. In this one, he's aside from the few opening scenes, he's pretty much violent and extreme and gone right from the get-go. Right. So in that respect, it's, you know, it differs. Um, I think really and I think what's interesting for me is that this was directed by James Whale, who was openly gay, and this feeling of being an outcast, being perhaps invisible to society, was something he portrayed. And well, not that he portrayed it, but it's something, the themes that he really sort of ran with this, and this idea of, you know, how even though you're, because that's the irony of this movie, is that he's the invisible man, but he is actually visible for most of the movie. He's just wrapped in bandages and looks very odd and you know, outside of the normal conventions of what you'd expect to see. So I think there's that element, and also this idea of the mob mentality sort of rounding him up and sort of getting him is something, you know, the themes that, you know, he's obviously trying to sort of bring across.
Yeah, I think you hit on something there. You know, that those two key elements of being an outcast and you know, a mob chasing him, stuff like that. You know, I imagine that part of it is like kind of, you know, like back in the 30s, you know, being, you know, gay and stuff is definitely was more than an issue. And you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that this other movie that he's known for is Frankenstein, which we'll, you know, kind of look at some point. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, certainly those two things kind of really click with him, that like, you know, he could probably saw himself at some point, you know, that he can, you know, imagine a mob coming after him, like kind of, in fact, you know, like you and I talked a little bit offline about how like, you know, like just with like Turin was, you know, another figure that was like, you know, persecuted for, you know, being gay and stuff like that. It just was a very different time. And yeah, I think that's like in the whole idea of a mob coming after you, I think is like kind of not too, you know, too remote a possibility and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sort of lampoons the whole idea of people persecuting other people, because he does sort of things like sort of throw money around and just sort of play. It's a weird sort of mixture of pranks and things that are genuinely dangerous, because at one stage he's singing a song and throwing money around, the next stage he's causing 100-person death of a train crash. So it's kind of, it covers this range of, you know, someone who could exist outside of the normal laws, could either be you know, someone very light-hearted who does something, you know, fairly innocuous, or someone who does something incredibly dangerous. It sort of quite nicely highlights the fact that without any bounds or checks, you know, anything is really possible.
Definitely. But by the way, the actor Claude Rains, you know, who plays you know, Griffin and stuff, was a relatively unknown, you know, Hollywood actor at the time, even though he had, you know, been on Broadway for quite a while. But he was like, you know, getting ready to apparently settle into his farm in New Jersey, that kind of thing. But then after The Invisible Man, he started getting, you know, roles in, you know, Robin Hood, Wolfman, and then you know, even ultimately, you know, pictures like Lawrence of Arabia, and then he's the the French captain in Casablanca as well. So
okay.
Yeah. So he definitely kind of like it launched his movie career after this movie and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's something. Yeah, it's he's obviously been, from what you listed, he's been in quite a few Hollywood classics there.
Yeah,
but not a name that's well known by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I think he does a good job of being able to, considering it's just basically a voiceover.
Right.
You know, it's very effective.
There's some point that what's called, I guess he was asking about, oh, you know, maybe I should do something with my eyes and stuff, and you know, like the director James Whale said to him, like, my dear, you know, boy, like, your eyes aren't going to show up in this, you know, like I was basically pointing out to him that, you know, you're visible, you're basically not seen the whole time stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of look at this movie a little bit like, you have to think about it somewhat in terms of a slightly superior kind of Michael Bay action movie in that frame, because it's mostly just special effects. That was what it would have been at the time. It's like this would have been a special effects showcase movie, really. And that's why you kind of, you know, you just see them in lots of different scenes of what you would do if you were invisible. Oh, you could fight someone. So it has that same violent element that the remake does as well. But it's also, you know, this idea that you could sabotage things, or you could actually be much more dangerous than you might, you know, people might imagine. So.
Yeah, I feel like this is like one of the earliest sci-fi movies, and it's like kind of it's pretty amazing what they were able to do, considering like this is all before green screen stuff. This is like kind of just basically using film on film, and kind of finding ways to kind of I guess what's called shoot things in certain ways and stuff like that. I read a little bit about it, and to be honest, I kind of like it was a little bit over my head. The kind of the tech, I guess, if you will, for the special effects.
Yeah, it's still pretty effective, even by well,
definitely
something not by today's standards, I guess, but it stood up pretty well, all things considered.
And I think
no, go for it.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think one, like you kind of started pointing out was, this idea of power at any cost. Like, it's really interesting that one of the specific lines that kind of stood out for me was he was saying to Flora, played by Gloria Stewart, I did it, all for you and stuff, and to me that kind of echoed like the line, one of the classic moments with Walter White from Breaking Bad, like basically talking about like kind of this idea of like besides kind of power, but just also like the ambition for it, that you're willing to kind of get it at any cost and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's perhaps more evident in the book, but the more invisible he becomes, the more corrupted by this lust for sort of power as he goes on. And I kind of see this as a little bit, as we were talking about some of the Luke Burgess talks in terms of, how we mimetically learn from other people in society, and it's our bonding through our mimetic crises and ritual that might be the sort of the gap between how the psychopath views things and his lack of ability to identify with the rest of society actually creates this sort of personal power ritual, essentially. And this is kind of what we're seeing, a sort of similar theme here, is someone that's effectively removed from society, becoming more and more dangerous.
Yeah, and this definitely, for me, brings up this idea, right? We of like the 1%, that like these folks who are so wealthy that they can barely relate to the average person who like has to like get their own coffee or make it and stuff, and versus like in fact I was watching another movie that kind of that's maybe at some point we'll talk about the Handmaiden and stuff, not no relation to Handmaid's Tale, but it was just like kind of something that popped up in the search and everything. And to me, that movie kind of like really, it's a Korean movie that really shows, this kind of distance that the wealthy have and stuff, with the elite, and it really makes it where then they feel above the law. They like kind of because the fact that like they have so much power, because of their wealth. A lot of times, they also just have like power that's kind of maybe even unrelated to the money stuff. But I guess it's like, in some ways you can't really separate the two, right? You can't really say it's like which part of it is because of the other stuff.
Yeah, well, not only sort of, I would say, not only sort of power dynamic there, but there's also just a sort of a general split from, you stop seeing the people lower down as humans almost.
Yes,
there's a lack of sort of humanity and empathy there that goes with it. And I mean, this is almost sort of, having seen some of the rather transactional relationships, we'll say, from my time in around LA, I guess in the various other places, these are almost sort of now social contracts of someone getting something from someone else for a certain price is well established. These are the both the powerful person and the person underneath both sort of understands their place to the point where this is just regular kind of society. We're not looking at these people as two human beings. We're looking at them as, different status elements, and that determines your level of human interaction in a way. But yeah. Anyway.
Definitely.
The only other thing I was going to say about this one, which was kind of interesting and sort of isn't something you see in the remake, is that, you're initially sort of thrown off by this person appearing in lots of bandages. So you're initially, they sort of play with this idea that you should initially feel sorry for the Invisible Man, because you think, oh, he's had a bad accident. What's this horrible accident? And I mean, in a way, you know, you should, because there is a level of permanency to what he's done. You know, he's injected himself with this serum and he's not going back. He's not going to become visible anytime soon. I mean, he's trying to work on it, but, you know, this is a fairly, you know, all-encompassing obsession for power that's brought him down this road. So it's much more, the invisible ability is much more convenient, we'll say, and a lot less sort of far-reaching in the remake.
Yeah, it's definitely like a substitute, I guess, in some ways for this control that he, you know, has, to, you know, only to the degree of like, you know, that the power of like kind of where that people can't really, because they can't see them, therefore they have no, you know, power control over him, stuff like that. But meanwhile, he's, you know, basically could toy with them and you know, just it's kind of, you know, like we just talked about, it's kind of removed and stuff, but also like where, you know, when you have that kind of control, like it really can make it where they seem like kind of insects or something that, like, you know, is less than human and stuff. And in fact, he really, you know, kind of just goes beyond that, which kind of it's interesting then. It's like kind of, but meanwhile, again, he has this thing with Flora, you know, like kind of that, like he, you know, professes his love and kind of, you know, like basically says, you know, like kind of, and it's this funny thing that on the one hand, you know, he has that kind of detachment. The other, he still has this attachment to her, and yeah, it's you know, like kind of it's really hard to say what it is, like kind of why, like kind of, you know, and I guess it's, you know, like maybe that thing of where you know, the narcissist part and stuff like that, that like that he still or feels like you know, like that's something that is his, and so, and I guess I'm trying to think that with whether that became an issue with like Kemp and stuff, the other doctor and stuff like that. I can't remember whether like they had any conflict over. I think he might have mentioned it briefly, but yeah, he just kind of like, I think he's just kind of brushes off, like, you know, like that's Kemp's vain attempt at trying to, you know, get Flora and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? He kind of just detaches himself from the rest of humanity, but still needs, but there's still the attachment to, you know, his love interest, which is actually a similar theme in the remake too, in a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's obviously much more expanded on. The other difference, I would say, that's subtle, but different between the two, and you mentioned about control, is that actually in the original, his potion is a method of transformation. So he actually has this permanent sort of transformation to the Invisible Man. So actually, he's out of control of his condition in a way.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas in the remake, he is perfectly in control, and it's more of a theme of illusion and deception of the people around him and manipulation, rather than someone who is, you know, has such an obsession with power that they become a victim of it, essentially. Which is sort of, I mean, in a bigger theme, and this was probably the first movie to even explore this kind of theme of, well, obviously it's in H.G. Wells' original story, and there's probably other science fiction books that have done it, but on the screen at least, you know, this idea that, you know, we could be a potential victim of our own scientific progress, that science could come and sort of derail us at some stage in the future, which was much more prevalent in the, you know, World War II with the invention of the atom bomb, because it seemed like any kind of monster movie there was just like, you know, oh, look what the atom bomb can do. Oh, next thing it's the big monster and stuff like this. So, yeah, it was quite ahead of its time in that respect, I think.
Definitely, yeah. We certainly saw that with The Fly, and how, like, basically, yeah, just by that point, yeah, it became pretty more established, this idea of science gone out of control and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think The Fly is an interesting sort of counter piece to this as well, both for the original and the remake in a way. I don't know if you want to move on to the remake, unless you've.
I think the only other kind of two things worth mentioning was so the actress, Gloria Stewart, she, mostly played in pre-code films. She was actually in the 1939 musical version of the Three Musketeers, which we skipped for our viewing, and she also ended up in James Cameron's Titanic as the senior, the Rose, the future or something like that. So that's another funny place that she turns up.
Right.
Her dad, Dr. Cranley, was played by Henry Travers, who was Clarence from It's a Wonderful Life. So that's probably the other thing worth mentioning.
So you look familiar. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, aside from, it's such an old movie now, but it's, was this a pre-code movie as well, would you say? I'm not sure if it was or not.
It's borderline. I'm not sure, to be honest. Yeah, I'd have to look at the date for, But
I would love to unearth like a pre-code movie that was just like really horribly violent or sexual and just skip through. There's like, someone hacking people's heads off or something like this. I don't think there was anything like that, but no. They could have done it. They could have done it.
Yeah, they could have.
But yeah. So it's an interesting sort of take in the as we say about The Fly, the reason I wanted to sort of mention that is that's almost like a natural sort of successor to the original Invisible Man, because again, it's someone who goes through a transformation where science becomes the downfall of the character, the main protagonist, and that more effectively makes you feel sorry for the protagonist, and then less so as he becomes more and more of a sort of removed from humanity. But it's a literal sort of physical removal rather than a psychological sort of anarchy, or as in the Invisible Man. Why I would say it's relevant for the 2020 version is that I actually one of the things that I was disappointed with it was that I didn't really feel like I cared about either Elizabeth Moss's character or the Invisible Man himself. There was no sort of sympathy, and there wasn't really much to actually get to know him. You didn't really have a history of their relationship. You didn't know that we're just taking her word for it at the beginning that the relationship was abusive. I mean, obviously you have to assume that because he's violent, but you don't actually know that at any point. But then there's also, because you don't see that sort of character development, I didn't really care very much about what happened to her as the movie went on, I guess, because I didn't see the attachment. I suppose like the Sydney character, the daughter and her dad is supposed to be kind of stand-ins for that and make you kind of like care about them. But it's funny. It's like the lack of building a love interest part of that relationship makes it less effective in a way. And The Fly is much better at that, the 1980s version, because you see their relationship and the struggle that they have trying to come to terms with the changes that are coming through. So that was an interesting one. And so that is a perfect, The Fly in the 80s Fly is a perfect example of characters that I care about that are going through this. And I'd say 20s is a much more kind of plot and event-based kind of movie, which I enjoyed because it did have some interesting turns and twists and things, but I didn't really care what happened to the characters. That's why I wanted my little rant about it. But anyway, So what did you think?
I feel like it's that shorthand we talked about before, that because people have a connection with Elizabeth Moss beforehand of playing The Handmaid, something like that. I feel like it's kind of like that. There's this expectation that they kind of they trust that she's been abused and traumatized, and so that's kind of like just a given. And I think mostly that what carries the that sympathy is how she starts off after she's escaped and stuff, that she's not even able to kind of make it out the front door to the mailbox and stuff. So I feel like they kind of did put in those elements to as a because they want to jump right into that in media res, that they're right in the middle of things and stuff with her, that they didn't want to kind of, like you said, spend too much time on the character development, that they were kind of, they would fill it in with these other things.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the things that happened were fairly interesting, but I wasn't really even sure what the relationship was between her and the policeman and his daughter. It all seemed a bit random. I didn't understand why she was living with them, really. Yeah, I guess for protection, maybe, but it seemed a bit random, really. I probably just missed a bit of the narrative or something, but neither of their characters were particularly.
Yeah, they didn't really explain it, and I feel like because I think this was such a tight movie that like they kind of really like, I feel like there was really very little fluff to it, that like you said, there's a lot of action, a lot of things kind of happen to it, that they kind of basically took it that like you'd buy into it, stuff like that, which then like kind of on the other hand, like anything else, there's always a price, right? And the price is, like you said, that then like whether or not you feel the sympathy, whether or not you kind of get like what's going on, that it seems like you said, maybe a little too random, that like she just suddenly ends up in the home of this friend and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help putting this, because obviously this is pretty much almost told from a more expanded version of almost Flora's character in the original, in a way, with her being much more involved and it being tied into their relationship. So you see this sort of progression of abuse and control and manipulation, but by the same token, though, I kind of feel this is relevant because it has a female protagonist. That's more in keeping with today's movies. The other thing I thought that was kind of an interesting angle for me, at least with the way I thought about it, was that it kind of toys with your expectations a little bit, in that sometimes, a woman might not be interested in continuing a relationship, and it doesn't have to be necessarily abusive per se, but one of the most ideal situations might be to sort of have a child from somebody wealthy, and then effectively make them invisible from their lives and just get their alimony payment as a paycheck. So it's almost like, in a way, it toys with this idea that this could actually all be like an ideal situation for her right in the beginning. And then obviously it unravels that. But yeah, it was kind of also interesting in the way they framed her as a female protagonist, because you have almost like two alpha males nearby. You have the kind of like jacked police dude who's just there sort of protecting everyone, who's ultimately ineffective at protecting her and her daughter. And you have the other sort of rich, wealthy, super strong alpha male who's brilliantly intelligent, right, who's just a complete sort of narcissist and psychopath. So it's quite interesting to sort of the way they positioned her as the hero in this movie between these these two sort of male characters, I thought.
Yeah, it's really kind of ironic that on the one hand, it seems to advertise itself as a kind of female empowerment movie, but like you said, in the end, it's kind of like to some degree, like you said, kind of between these two males, kind of the struggle and stuff like that. Although it does kind of put the things or the power back into her hands.
Oh yeah,
I guess we won't spoil it too much, but it's it kind of, I think it feels like there's this kind of bouncing around, I guess, of like who's in charge. Like I think part of the reason why that is because she basically starts off like you said, traumatized, and where she's kind of again not able to kind of walk out the door, so she's kind of more than vulnerable. She's like just really just a shell of a person. But then as time goes on, she's kind of like just not only taking back more of the power, but then ultimately she and I really don't want to give away the clincher ending, because that's like kind of really spoils it and stuff. But it definitely is that thing of where it's a building up of that, and it's a definitely makes the movie. I guess that's where they stuck the landings, just having that clincher, I guess.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty interesting sort of few twists and turns in the end there. That made it quite satisfying as a movie, I thought. I think
Right.
my only disappointment was that, well, the few disappointments actually, as you may have gathered, is that I kind of knew the basic premise. So the first half an hour to an hour,
Oh, okay.
I kind of knew what was going to happen.
Okay.
In that, you kind of know she's going to be manipulated. But then it was quite good that the fact that there was quite a lot after that did a few interesting sort of twists and turns and things like this. But I mean, I think but as I say, my main, other than the lack of the sort of character development, the other thing that I kind of was a bit disappointed was they didn't play with this idea that, he's manipulating her to appear sort of paranoid and delusional.
Right.
So he kind of frames it in a way of like he alienates her from her friends, isolates her through these various sort of things that he does. But I would have liked to have sort of seen that more cleverly done, in that you as the audience, you already know that she is being manipulated by this invisible dude. And I think it would have been more interesting if they made it so that the audience was questioning that as well. Because there's a certain, I think we watched some of these Japanese horror movies where left a little bit, it's a little more of a sort of gray area as to whether are they seeing ghosts, or is it this all just being made up in their heads? And so they kind of do it subtly at the beginning, but it's one of those things where I think they tried to go out and out with the horror element of, you being, I just felt like I saw, even though it was a shadow or an indentation of the Invisible Man, I felt like I saw him too quickly. I thought they could have played with the psychological elements of her potentially just making this up for a lot longer.
Right. Yeah. In one of the interviews, the writer director talked about that, about like kind of they almost wanted to kind of drag that out longer, but I guess like it seems like maybe what the concern was that like they wanted to kind of really build into the idea of that, like she, like we know as the audience that like she's right and stuff like that, but I think they just basically wanted to just bring out the fact that like everyone else, like you said, thinks she's crazy and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of like where they wanted to confirm that we, like for our eyes, that she is sane, that, and like rather than leave that as a question and stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess there's also, it's rather sort of dangerous ground for a Hollywood movie to step if it's looking at a sort of a case of domestic abuse and then kind of makes the sort of a gray area argument that maybe she's just making it all up.
Right.
That's a fairly yes. that's not a very, you can't really do that, I don't think.
Right. Good point.
Yeah, so I can see why they did the way, but also in a way actually I also can understand that my argument may not go down well in our sort of postmodern cinema going, because we've probably seen quite a few episodes where they leave things overly gray for the entire movie. Maybe that just gets irritating after a while. You're just like, well, go one way or the other. Is she mad or not? And so in a way, it's kind of more satisfying in that it does get, becomes more of a sort of almost an action movie, I would say, in some respects. So very reminiscent of actually Terminator 2. That's what it made me think of, the bit where Linda Hamilton, no one believes her.
Oh, right.
Someone's stalking her, and again, you actually have like an invisible kind of assassin who can blend into things. So, yeah, it was this weird sort of mixture of Terminator 2 and the original Invisible Man with a bit of The Fly kind of thrown in for good measure, I felt.
Yeah, it's interesting how this idea of domestic violence and stuff, that as where the the woman different times does not believe and stuff like that, and like in other words, it's kind of like I guess the allegory, I guess the idea that although it's I also don't feel like it's kind of really hidden. It's pretty much on the surface as to like what's going on stuff.
Yeah, even this idea of the invisible man and abuse being sort of hidden in from society, it was a very interesting sort of idea of tying that in.
I feel like it's almost like a trope now, the rich controlling man, you know, like, as the abuser and stuff. I mean, I could think of at least, you know, like kind of a couple movies that like have that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how true that is. I don't know that someone who had lots of resources and lots of options of lots and lots of partners would necessarily feel like they had to sort of manipulate and control one particular person. I would have thought the opposite would be the case, that they would have so many options that they probably wouldn't give too much thought to it. And that was kind of, you know, they tried to sort of explain that in that said, oh, you were the only one that didn't want him, so that's why he now obsesses over you, which kind of yeah, I mean, I guess we can't have what we, you know, we want what we can't have, but I don't know.
Hard to say.
Yeah.
I think a couple kind of casting things to mention. The Invisible Man, you know, in this case, the character Adrian Griffin, who's basically, you know, the scientist that kind of invents this invisible technology and stuff like that, is played by Oliver Jackson-Cohen. And we'll actually talk about him at some point with the Haunting of Hill House and stuff. A funny kind of connection is that that's a book that's originally written by Shirley Jackson, and coincidentally, Elizabeth Moss more recently also played Shirley Jackson in the movie called Shirley and stuff. So that's a funny kind of ironic. I don't think it's, of course, any planning or whatever, but kind of just funny connection.
Yeah.
Michael Dorman, who plays the brother and stuff like that, was actually Gordo from that show that we've mentioned a couple times for All Mankind and stuff. One of the key astronauts in that one. This series, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the brother was quite an interesting character, actually, in that, you know, he was, you know, well, I don't want to sort of give it away, but he was, you know, you kind of knew he was a bad guy from the get-go, in so much as, you know, he was a lawyer. You can't trust lawyers, can you? So, yeah. Yeah, it was I guess you have to ask, you know, at what point was he the one out there doing it, and at what point was the other one? And it's quite good, and they leave that a little bit sort of. I would say, actually, if there's one element that is quite good about this, the gray area is whether, you know, is the brother actually the original Adrian? Is he actually, you know, the one manipulating it or not? Because you could actually argue that he isn't, and she just completely misinterprets everything.
Right.
Because they do leave that pretty, you know, quite great. You could just pin it all on the brother.
I mean, we take it all on her word, and you know, if it was like one of the more psychological movies, definitely, you know, it could be like, you know, ironic twist that like that somehow they made it even more seem like that maybe it was all in her head. But then again, you know, because of the whole domestic violence thing, I think that's why they kind of like steered clear of that ambiguity and stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a more sort of interesting idea, I think. And it's a shame they didn't have the cojones to try and go that route, because you know, at the end of the movie, you could have made it more grand that ultimately, and I'm going to spoil this now for anybody who's watching, but you know, she could have, in some respects, had the child of someone, you know, who was very successful, who actually, okay, maybe, well, she said he was controlling and abusive, but if you took that out, you could have said, well, maybe she accidentally, you know, killed the father of, you know, you could have played it as a misinterpretation, and he was innocent, and she sort of killed the father of her child and things like this. Yeah. But that is another thing that's very, you know, is and this is obviously going back again, like you said, a shorthand using her from Handmaid's Tale is this idea that she finds out because she's pregnant. It's adds a whole new dimension of sort of trauma and manipulation to the entire sort of proceedings. So yeah, that's not an easy one to deal with in a 2-hour horror movie, but interesting that they used it in this time.
One small detail that I found really suspicious, and maybe like in that moment, I probably wouldn't have questioned either. But like when the brother was confirming, like Adrian was dead and stuff like that, and she was questioning it. He just conveniently had this envelope of photos, like he had to pull out, oh, I know he's dead. Like it's like you're really like you were expecting her to talk about this, and like you just happen to have these photos of him, lying in a pool of blood. Yeah.
Yeah, because of course they give those to lawyers all the time when they're just signing monetary agreements. Yeah, that was. I guess then it also makes you wonder if, like, was it the opening of the bank account the thing that led to him being able to find her location?
Right.
Because that was what I sort of implied from that. It wasn't that explicit, but yeah.
Because otherwise, how did the letter, like basically arranging for the meeting, get to her, right, and stuff?
Yeah, true. Yeah, food for thought. That's
because she did seem suspicious, but it's like kind of at the same time, it's funny how like kind of she didn't think about that, and kind of like how did they find me, like because like she what's it called, she was so paranoid that she told like she was upset at her sister for following or coming over or something like that, and like I you have to like she was like you have to do as I say, and
yeah.
So anyways.
I mean, I will say this. I thought the scene in the restaurant was very effective.
Yes. Unbelievable.
Yeah. That was really, really amazing. To be honest, pretty much up until that point, I was kind of semi-watching this movie to some degree. And after that point, I was like, okay, you have my attention now.
It's just the way it was executed too, like just like her sitting there and everybody seeing her, like you just like you just can imagine, like I feel that's kind of what was really effective about it too, was like that you could just imagine you're sitting there in a restaurant with a bloody knife and stuff, and this person's dead, and like what would everyone's reaction be and stuff, and what would be your reaction then?
Yeah.
I didn't do it. Yeah. Okay.
But I like the way it was still framed within his idea of what their relationship represented, because she was about to give away his secret, which is I thought it was the timing of that was really well done. And I guess we should mention actually the guy that wrote this and directed this is the guy that wrote Saw.
Yes.
Or maybe co-creator. I don't know if he was the sole creator.
With James Wan. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Insidious.
Yeah, and Insidious. So it's I would say the second half of the movie feels more like one of like a Saw movie to some degree.
Okay, interesting.
I mean, I guess that it's the manipulation and the control elements of what sort of are very well done in this. In that, much like A Handmaid's Tale, systematically lots of people are alienated and she loses everything through a series of sort of coordinated events, which I thought was well done.
I think also worth mentioning was Johnny Depp was actually attached to the project at one point. This was way before. I feel like it would have been an ironic twist if like it was with him and then Amber Heard as a co-star, based on all the kind of the things between their domestic violence dramas and stuff.
Oh God, yeah, no, that would have probably been too close to the bone, I imagine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean it's it's an interesting one, because somebody asked me whether it was a good movie the other day, and they didn't like horror movies, they didn't really like gore, and I said, well, actually it's not really that gory, this movie, aside from two very, very shocking parts of it. It's pretty much it's mostly just sort of violence and stuff, but it's done quite effectively. And I thought actually some of the opening scenes where he's actually stalking her, and she's like looking into sort of empty closets and things like this, and peering around doorways was quite effectively done actually. And I thought the bottle just appearing on the was really good. And that was where I was kind of like, oh, I really like this kind of more psychological approach. But then it turned into Terminator 2. But yeah, no, I did enjoy it though. Is it better than the original? I don't know, it's a very different movie. There's no comedy in this at all. There's no real.
No.
I mean, it's it's social commentary, but in a completely different way, rather than it being a more sort of overarching commentary on lack of laws and lack of accountability. It becomes much more, I suppose it is still that, but it's more who has, how you can be manipulated in a relationship and what the stakes are within that, and how you can break out of it, I guess.
I feel like the original Invisible Man was a sci-fi classic. It's definitely etched itself into people's imagination. Kind of, it's just one of those kind of must see if you're a sci-fi fan. And then this new one is this kind of suspense thriller that's been updated. Kind of very modern themes and stuff. And yeah, like you said, to compare is like kind of the whole apples and oranges thing, where it's like they're very different movies, and it's really really hard. Like, even though it's technically a remake and more official than probably other remakes we've seen, but it's like it's just really you can't really call it a remake in the sense of like because just other than the invisible technology, there's very little other than the parallels we've drawn. There's very little connection as to the original.
Well, I mean, it's invisible technology in this, unlike a potion or formula in the original.
Right.
And that has the advantage of, rather than it enables the ending by making it a tool rather than a condition. You enable more options as to what the story can do.
Yeah,
and which is used to great effect actually towards the end.
Oh yeah, I'm thinking it's just having that, like like you said, rather than this potion that kind of changes permanently, having a suit that you can put on, that would be awesome. I mean, just imagine having that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he would get a lot of government contracts for his invention, no doubt about it.
Man, can you imagine a war that's fought with invisible soldiers?
Good God, yeah. Yeah, it'd be absolute carnage, wouldn't it? I mean, yeah, I also couldn't help, this is totally tangent, I couldn't help looking at his house and thinking how cool it looked as well. There was just lots of nice things in his house and effects with the lighting and things. And yeah, I went back into sort of interior design mode there a little bit. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they didn't really get much. They weren't, I was thinking of the policeman and his daughter, Sydney. They didn't really do anything other than provide her, some stakes, which they could sort of amp up, or things that she could lose, essentially.
Right.
Yeah. It's very weird that they didn't define that, because all of a sudden she's paying for her college and,
Well, I mean, to me, that's like kind of the implication that like kind of this is somebody who's really close, like you would go to that extent. So in other words, they were doing a lot of shorthand to take the place of like kind of basically, like, look at it this way. At least they didn't like spend like kind of a bunch of time on dialogue explaining their relationship, right? Like the whole expository kind of thing, which a lot of movies have the sin of doing and stuff. So I feel like on the one hand, it would have been good to kind of provide some background and kind of context and stuff. But the other, at least they didn't do it through dialogue.
Yeah, I have to say, I you could go both ways. Actually, I preferred this way, to be honest with you. It's like in a horror movie, an 80s slasher movie, you don't really need to know the backstory of the two teenagers that are getting killed by Freddy Krueger. It's surplus to requirement. And so I think I'll go back perhaps on for their characters, I don't think it matters. I think it mattered more for, Griffin and whatever the character's name was, Elizabeth Moth's character, basically. That I felt there could have been more. But yeah. Yeah, so I think it was pretty effective, actually. I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, so overall, definitely, both worth watching, and we definitely would recommend it. By the way, like what's interesting also is that this was released during the beginning of the pandemic and stuff, and they still managed though to 10x their between like the budget and the gross and stuff like that. So they actually, like on a budget of $7 million, they have managed ultimately to make over 140 million.
Oh wow!
Even though like it was released just as things were shutting down, stuff like that. So that's pretty amazing.
Horror movies, all about the money, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that before this was like kind of discussion, during the Mummy, whatever, of that they wanted to kind of have this their dark universe kind of thing and stuff for Universal, but ultimately they, with the flopping of the Mummy, they kind of canceled that idea, and then so that was yet another reason why this has no connection to the whole that thought of connecting, their version of the MCU, I guess.
Studios are so desperate to have these nice little franchise collection thing, and have them all neatly kind of tied together with a bow. But it's doing
it in practice, not so easy.
No, in fact, it's almost a case that one of the movies will be good and all the rest will be terrible or average at best. But I mean, it's good that they try at least, because at least that one of these kind of reboots, or franchise things will actually work quite well. I would say, of anything that Universal's done, horror related, this is by far the best attempt.
So at some point, my thought was that we definitely want to look at, like the Mummy, because it's, been a remake and stuff, Frankenstein and Dracula. Certainly, there's many different, iterations over the years.
That'll keep us busy for the rest of the year. It's been I've lost count of the number of Dracula movies there are, but I know.
So, so any other last thoughts on?
Not really. I think,
So I think we talked about watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I constantly get those backwards. And then definitely. I don't know if like kind of after that, what we'll I guess we'll kind of regroup and see what will be other movies we have coming up. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you at the movies.